The word human and its many variations can hold countless different meanings. Humanity is, on occasion, used to describe righteous or good morality, yet the word human on its own can be used to emphasize the flaws within someone. For example, we all make mistakes. We're human after all. Sure, we are human, and yes, humans do make mistakes. I've made as many mistakes in my life as anyone else. Just because we all have flaws doesn't mean we should brush off our issues as just a part of our species. There is a lot of good to it, or at least what we call good from our humanitarian perspective. And there's a lot of bad, too. The very apparent and obvious truth is that humanity is flawed, fatally so. I could list everything wrong with being human, but there's an anime that excellently lays out many of the more intriguing and apparent items on that list. It is easier to see the flaws in others than it is in ourselves. So let's dissect the glaring flaws of an egotistical witch and all of the people she meets along her travels. It's a bit disappointing that Elena, as a character, isn't thoroughly explored in the anime adaptation of Journey of Elena. From the first minute of the first episode, it's clear that she's not a nice person for the sake of being nice, nor is she a righteous person by any means. She's just herself. She has a colossal ego, and places her well-being above everyone else's, only worrying about herself. In her eyes, her life isn't worth risking to save people she doesn't know. Unfortunately, the characterization of Elena in the anime isn't quite consistent like it is in the light novels. Really, only the first episode is able to successfully capture Elena's twisted personality from an outsider lens, as well as how her ego is stomped into the ground. Elena, the Apprentice Witch, is an episode that serves primarily as an introduction to the focal point of the show, Elena. She's the center of everything that happens, and she doesn't hold back in letting everyone know it. She worked hard to become a witch, passing the exam at an early age with ease, and allowed her repeated achievements of grandeur to build up her already strong self-image. Elena never faced a true challenge leading up to her apprenticeship, which repeatedly brought up the question of whether or not anything in the world could challenge her. The answer to that question was almost always no, making Elena truly start to believe that maybe she was just the best. And then she met the Stardust Witch, Fran. Although Elena was arrogant of her abilities, she still respected Fran's authority and greater experience. That speck of modesty was tested repeatedly by Fran, until it finally caved and Elena revealed her true ego. That was when Fran decided to challenge it and put it in the dirt. Fran did what she did not to boost her own ego or to quote-unquote put Elena in her place. I mean, Elena's demeanor in the later episodes show that such a strategy wouldn't have worked at all. Fran fought Elena to relieve the idea that nothing could challenge her. Her actions emphasized the existence of Elena's egotistical thought process, so that she could acknowledge it and control it. When you're aware of your own perspective and emotions, it's a lot easier to control them. Elena is, of course, an illustration of a very commonly known human flaw: ego. It's natural for us to feel pride in our accomplishments, but sometimes too many accomplishments without setbacks can nurture arrogance. Likewise, too many setbacks can nurture a negative self-image, which is arguably as bad as an oversized ego. Ego is something that some believe we have to balance on a day-to-day basis. However, Elena's character arc proposes a new method of dealing with such a flaw. Instead of balancing it, simply being aware of it can be enough. If you know that your ego is skewed in one way or the other, you can adjust your mindset in situations so as to not skew it any more than it already is. And you can even adjust the way you convey yourself around others, so that they won't perceive you as flawed. Although manipulative, Elena's strategy might be effective. Ego is a natural human flaw that, for many, is simply too unstable to even bother rectifying. A girl and her sister travel to the land of mages with a shared dream of becoming witches together. They train hard, beginning off on equal footing. As time passes, one of the sisters starts to show superior talent and skill, despite them both undergoing similar practice of magecraft. The day for the apprentice witch exam finally arrives. One of the sisters passes, and the other fails. The successful one returns to her home to share the good news, leaving her sister behind to work alone. Before that day, Saya was never alone. No matter what may have happened, she always had her sister, until that sister left her behind. She felt betrayed, isolated, and incredibly lonely. Then, a beautiful young witch arrived in the land of mages. Saya used an underhanded plan to get the girl, named Elena, to stay at the inn Saya worked in, for the hopes that Elena could train her. The plan worked, and Elena agreed to help. Not only did Elena agree, she showed Saya a small amount of affection. It was something that Saya had been deprived of for so long that she latched on immediately. She held on to Elena for as long as possible, but eventually had to let go of even her. It's a situation all too familiar for us humans. We are weak to loneliness and isolation, requiring others of our species to keep us sane, especially when we've lived our lives accustomed to constant affection from others. The fear of being alone is the sole reason some people will even stay in a relationship, which leads to a very toxic situation. It's something that affects all of us, and unfortunately, we can't really do anything about it. Unlike with ego, the anime doesn't really try to find a solution for this flaw. Its only purpose is to demonstrate how important it is for us to cherish the time we humans get to spend with others, and how to remain strong when we are left alone. For most of us, being together with others is just not something we can live without. Humans are not only weak to attachment or ego, we are weak to emotions and physical substances too. The first half of episode 3, The Girl as Pretty as a Flower, has a few very straightforward messages about human flaws. It touches on how humans seek specific people, specific emotions, and physical beauty with the guard and his sister. The guard wanted to find his sister, no matter what, which instigated him to enter the magical flower field. His sister and many other civilians entered the field originally because they were raptured by its physical beauty, as is a common occurrence with humans. The primary cause of their actions was their manipulability. Humanity is easily manipulated, especially by physical substances such as chemicals or drugs. The flower field is a shallow yet strong symbol of our likelihood to get involved with these substances and what they can cause. Like emotions, ego, or loneliness, they impair our judgments and can be addictive. Elena could have helped the country, but she valued her own life over theirs. Her decision was representative of the taboo nature of our manipulability. When others are impaired by these things to the point of it becoming or causing issues, we tend to avoid the subject altogether. When others are manipulated, that is when we as humans turn our heads away the most. The second half of the third episode, Bottled Happiness, isn't quite so direct, though it is equally as dark. Emil bottles happiness for Nino, believing that showing it to her will make her feel happier. Not only was he wrong in thinking that deeply rooted depression is something so easily changed, but he was also wrong in thinking that the bottled happiness could help. Nino was trapped in that home, and the joyful sights from around the outside world only told her what she was missing out on. Emil exhibits another human flaw, our tendency to be insensitive. It's nearly impossible to completely be aware of all of your own biases and perspectives. There are just too many, and some of them have been with us for so long that we don't even realize they exist in the first place. Due to this, we are more than likely going to say or do something insensitive at different points in our lives. While it may be natural, that doesn't mean we should give up on preventing it. As Elena does in this episode, we should also try to understand the reasoning behind others' insensitivities, rather than just assuming that they are bad people. A princess fell in love with a cook and became pregnant. Infuriated, the king ordered the cook be executed and the princess's child be killed. It's a story that felt vaguely familiar when Elena recounted it in the episode, The Princess Without Subjects. The king's actions were despicable, but I can somewhat understand his reasoning. The story behind the episode handles a similar theme to the first episode of the series, only this time in a different context. It focuses more on pride and dignity rather than ego. The king had the pride and dignity of his country and position to uphold, and forced that same responsibility on his daughter, as is to be expected of royalty. The king had been taught the disparity between social classes, and that the lower classes should hardly interact with the higher ones, let alone intermarry. He did what he thought he had to do to prevent his pride and dignity, which he valued over his daughter's happiness, from collapsing. His dignity is something that we all have, though maybe not to the same level. We all will avoid doing or choose to do something if it means keeping our dignity intact. The king's extreme case dissuades us from letting that dignity rule our lives and the lives of those we are supposed to hold dear. If the truth is a sword, then lies are its scabbard. In a nation where people cannot lie, no one speaks. A king had a witch create a magic sword, which placed a barrier around the nation and prevented all those who entered from lying in spoken or written language. So, the inhabitants would lie through gestures, sounds, and facial expressions. Anytime people spoke, it would lead to a fight. Once the barrier was broken, the overall happiness of the nation's residents increased even higher than what it was before the barrier was created. The flaw illustrated in the episode, The Land of Truth Tellers, was humanity's reliance on lies. As the residents of the nation did, we all rely on lies to keep ourselves and others happy. Our true thoughts can sometimes differ from how we want to act or from what we want to believe, making them hurtful to others and ourselves. Honesty and integrity are important, but without lies, that honesty becomes a blade waiting to be swung. Like a scabbard conceals and holsters a blade from reckless use, lies conceal and holster the truth. We rely on lies to prevent confrontation, to keep our ideals, to maintain relationships, and for plenty of other things. It's just another one of our flaws. The two stories of episode 7 cover similar themes to each other. Both of them are about two different places that polarize and separate themselves from each other. Both countries in The Wall Edged by Travelers and villages in The Grape Stomping Girl are envious of each other's achievements, constantly fighting to be the best of the two. In the case of the countries separated by a wall, they couldn't even see the residents of the other side, who were actually very similar. The first story of The Wall is more about polarization in the fear of difference, whereas the second story is more about polarization in competition. Both sides of the wall were afraid of the possible differences between them and the other side. Not being able to see the lack of differences gave them room to imagine, causing them to stereotype the other side and label them as an outgroup. Once they actually saw the other side and realized they were all just normal people, the wall was taken down. Our imaginations are powerful in good and bad ways. The more we have time to imagine our differences with others, the more apparent they become. It's a thought process that creates division, and that can only be stopped by awareness. Moreover, imagining what other people have over us, like with the wine villages, makes those differences more apparent too. Comparison of wealth and achievement will only anger and divide us when we should be focused on cooperation. Once the two villages came together, they went from the two best winemaker villages to the best winemaker village. Individual achievements shouldn't be ignored or disregarded, but when competition isn't necessary, cooperation should always at least be considered, as it is almost always the most efficient option. Like with The Girl as Pretty as a Flower, The Ripper, episode 8 of the series, is about how certain things can impair a human's judgment. We can be attached to things just as much as we can be attached to people. We all have things that we like, and those feelings of enjoyment can easily grow into an unhealthy obsession. It's quite similar to addiction, though it is usually portrayed as more elegant. The Ripper doesn't do this. The dollmaker goes to extreme lengths to see the emotions of people's faces, a sight that she is obsessed with. Her methods, appearance, and behavior when being influenced by her obsession are anything but elegant. Elena separates herself from the dollmaker, believing that she can't relate at all, just like she did with the residences of the country surrounded by the flower field. We don't all enjoy the same things, so when others become obsessed with bizarre things that impair their judgments to dangerous levels, we isolate them without trying to understand or help. Elena has an obsession with herself, and Saya has an obsession with Elena. Both of them have done things we as viewers might see as strange or wrong due to their obsessions, yet they both look at the dollmaker with disgust. Episodes 9 and 12 both cover flaws related to memories and the past. In Episode 9, A Deep Sorrow from the Past, Estelle reminisces on her time with Selena. Armed only with the pictures of Selena smiling and a filter that blocked out any negative memories, Estelle enlisted Elena's help to save Selena from becoming a serial killer. The two of them travel back in time, only to discover that Selena is the one who originally killed her own parents. Estelle used all of the magic she could to kill Selena and wipe her existence from her memories. She couldn't accept something that contrasted from the bright and cheery Selena she remembered. It's a phenomenon known as the nostalgia bias, viewing the past with rose-tinted glasses. Nostalgia is a great feeling to have, as I've discussed in my video An Encounter with Nostalgia's Ghost, but we must realize that our view of the past through that feeling is going to be skewed in a way that makes it seem positive. We, as humans, only remember what we want to remember or what is most impactful to us. Sometimes the most impactful thing is the regret we feel. In Episode 12, The Everyday Tale of Every Ashen Witch, Elena meets all of her possible current selves. The evil Elena, the one who never got her hair back from the Ripper, allowed the traumatic events of her travels to build up a regret and prevent her from moving forward. When she saw all of her different selves, that regret built up even more. The true Elena comforted the evil one by telling her to use all of the other versions of herself as a motivator for what she could do rather than a representation of what she failed to do. Our embarrassing or traumatic memories will replay in our heads repeatedly throughout our lives. When we look at those memories, we will usually look at what we could have done, and in doing so, regret what we did. It's important that we fight that mindset, as the true Elena explained to the evil one. We cannot change what we did, so we should look forward and try to repair ourselves and our relationships one step at a time. Regret is something that we won't be able to stop entirely, like nearly every flaw I've discussed thus far, but we can immediately combat it by changing perspectives. If we look at what we failed to do, we won't see what we successfully did do. We should look at the bad alternatives that we avoided, instead of just the good ones we were unable to achieve. Majo no Tabi Tabi is an anime about the many fatal flaws of being human. It highlights some of the most prevalent and interesting ones to dissect, including the issues of humanity's oversized and undersized egos, weakness to isolation, manipulability, tendency to insensitivity, dignity, reliance on lies, fear of difference, comparison of difference, obsession, nostalgia bias, and regret. It's also about how those flaws can be looked at as positives and strategies to at least somewhat resolve the negative ones. These flaws shouldn't be looked at with disgust, because we all exhibit them to some degree or another. Looking away from their existence is like looking away from a mirror. It's possible that someday we'll be rid of these flaws as humans, and will become the perfect beings we strive to achieve. But I'm not so sure I want that. Our problems give us character, uniqueness. It's a part of what makes us special enough for us to try and replicate it on other species and artificial intelligence. It's part of what makes us, well, human.